Imagine waking up in a world where your life expectancy is just 43 years old,
Wow. That is, yeah, that's hard to even conceptualize.
right? And you have no internet, no smartphones. Your entire country is totally economically isolated, and I mean, your reality is almost entirely agrarian.
So you're basically farming to survive.
Exactly. Now, imagine watching that exact same country just leap straight into the mobile internet era, like double its average lifespan and multiply its economic output tenfold in a single generation.
Which is an absolute miracle on paper.
It is. But then, and here's the kicker, you watch that exact same economy suddenly shrink by nearly a fifth almost overnight.
Yeah, it really sounds like science fiction. Or, perhaps a simulation running at fast forward where someone just occasionally unplugs the server.
That's a great way to put it.
But that extreme, almost whiplash-inducing trajectory is the actual lived reality for over 54 million people.
It is. And welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive, everyone. We are super glad to have you with us.
Glad to be here, as always.
So we are taking a massive stack of sources today. Specifically, a sweeping, highly detailed data assessment report spanning from 1960 all the way up to 2023.
It's a massive timeline.
Yeah, and we're extracting the core narrative. We're cross-referencing decades of national data with these massive global indicator data sets, stuff from the World Bank, the UN, global health organizations, you name it.
The amount of data in this report is just, it's dense.
Oh, totally. Our mission for you today is to understand the mechanics of a nation experiencing rapid transformation, staggering growth, and profound systemic shocks. We are, of course, talking about Myanmar.
And, to truly understand the sheer scale of what has happened in Myanmar over these last 6 decades, we really have to discard any preconceived notions we might have about how a nation develops.
Right, because development is rarely just a neat, linear march of progress.
Exactly. Here we are looking at 4 distinct but deeply interconnected pillars. We've got the macroeconomic volatility, the shifting social demographics, a truly baffling healthcare paradox, and then the underlying governance and environmental constraints.
Which kind of act as a ceiling on everything else, right?
Yeah, they absolutely do.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to jump straight into that first pillar, the economic roller coaster.
The gross domestic product shockwaves, yeah.
Yeah, because the GDP shockwaves we are looking at are just hard to wrap my head around. If we look at the trajectory, the sheer velocity of the boom and bust cycle is staggering.
It's completely unprecedented in a lot of ways.
In the early 2000s, this data shows growth peaking at around 13.8%, which, for a bit of context for you listening, if an economy is growing at 3 or 4%, people are generally pretty happy.
Whoa, absolutely. 3% is healthy.
Right. And 7 or 8% is an absolute boom. But 13.8%, that's just wild.
That is hyper growth. I mean, at 13.8%, the physical landscape of a country literally changes before your eyes.
Like new cities popping up.
Yeah, exactly. You are seeing a nation rapidly generating new wealth, pulling in foreign capital, and expanding its economic footprint at a breakneck pace. This isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet.
It's real life.
Right. It manifests as new construction projects dominating skylines, roads being paved where dirt paths existed literally months prior,
Wow.
and consumer goods just flooding into markets that were previously bare. We see this reflected perfectly in the GDP per capita, measured in 2015 constant dollars.
Okay, let's look at those numbers.
So in 1960, the average economic output per person was a mere $129.
Wait, $129 for an entire year?
Yes, for the whole year.
That is so low.
But then by 2020, that number had hit a peak of around $1,440.
Okay, so we are looking at more than a tenfold increase in a single lifetime.
Exactly.
If you are a citizen living through that specific window, your entire reality is just completely rewritten.
Oh, completely.
Like, your parents grew up in a heavily agrarian, low-income environment, and suddenly you find yourself navigating this rapidly commercializing, globalizing economy.
It's a massive generational shift.
But the momentum doesn't hold, does it? The data hits 2021, and we see a catastrophic contraction.
Yeah, a negative growth shock in the range of -12 to -18%.
Negative 18%. We really need to pause and unpack the mechanics of a contraction that severe?
We do, because economic growth naturally fluctuates. Business cycles ebb and flow, right?
Sure.
You might see a 1 or 2% contraction during a normal global recession, but a shock of -12 to 18%. That effectively erases a decade of hard-won economic gains almost overnight.
What does a contraction of that magnitude actually look like on the ground? I'm trying to compare it to, the 2008 global financial crisis.
Right.
But even then, the U.S. economy only shrank by around 10.5% annually.
It's a completely different magnitude of crisis. When an economy shrinks by nearly a fifth, you don't just see a slowdown in hiring or like a dip in consumer spending.
So what breaks first?
You see the cascading collapse of fundamental supply chains. Factories don't just reduce shifts, they shutter entirely because they cannot secure raw materials or reliable electricity.
Right.
Formal employment evaporates, which forces millions of workers violently back into the informal sector just to survive. Credit markets completely freeze.
Because nobody is lending money in that environment.
Exactly. The velocity of money, which is how fast a single dollar moves through the economy, grinds to a halt because everyone is hoarding whatever capital they have left.
It's a total systemic freeze. And this contraction is even more complicated when you look at the underlying DNA of Myanmar's economy, right?
Yes, because it had completely mutated in the decades leading up to this crash.
Historically, agriculture was the undisputed backbone of this country. But the data shows agriculture recently hitting negative growth, shrinking by 2.1%.
Which is a huge structural shift.
Meanwhile, industry, which includes manufacturing and construction, jumped from under 10% of the economy in the 1990s to over 37% recently.
That is a textbook example of structural transformation.
But the service sector is the real story here. I mean, it took the crown at over 41%.
Which is fascinating.
Right. Because I always assumed the standard path of national development was, well, you start with farming, then you move to light manufacturing like textiles.
The traditional industrial revolution model.
Yeah, and then heavy industry. And only after you've built a robust industrial base do you transition into a service-heavy economy like banking, logistics, retail, stuff like that.
Right, that's the standard textbook progression.
But here, services leapfrog to the top very quickly. Why would a developing nation pivot so heavily into services before fully maturing its industrial base?
That is a really critical observation. In an environment characterized by historical volatility and institutional uncertainty, heavy industry is just a massive risk.
Because the upfront costs.
Exactly. Building a massive steel mill or a sprawling automotive plant requires pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into physical assets that cannot be moved.
Right, you can't just pack up a steel mill in a suitcase if things get unstable.
No, you can't. It requires a guarantee of stable property rights, consistent energy grids, and decades of predictable policy to actually see a return on investment. Services, however, are far more agile.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Telecommunications, retail franchises, digital logistics, these require way less sunk physical capital and can adapt more rapidly to a changing environment.
It's like a farmer deciding to build a factory, but eventually realizing they make the most money just running the factory's cafeteria and logistics network instead.
That's a great analogy.
If I'm an investor, I don't want to build a massive factory if the rules might change tomorrow. I'd rather set up a telecom network or a financial services firm where my primary assets are digital or highly liquid.
Precisely. However, that agility comes with a really severe vulnerability.
Okay, what's the catch?
Well, agriculture relies on the seasons, and while vulnerable to climate, it possesses a certain rugged resilience. A manufacturing plant can run a diesel generator and keep producing physical goods to stockpile in a warehouse.
Even if the power grid goes down.
Exactly. But a service economy relies entirely on real-time stability. It requires constant, uninterrupted electricity, reliable internet connectivity, and consumer trust.
I see. So if you've transitioned 41% of your economy to services, you are incredibly exposed.
Highly exposed.
If the power grid fails, or if there's an internet blackout, the farmer might still be able to harvest. The factory might have a generator.
Right.
But the digital logistics company, the mobile banking app, the modern retail supply chain, they all instantly drop to zero output.
Which perfectly explains why that 2021 shock was so deeply devastating. A modernized, service-oriented economy is highly interconnected.
So when one piece falls, they all fall.
Exactly. When the macro environment destabilizes, the service sector doesn't just bend, it breaks. And this vulnerability leads us directly into how this rapid structural transformation was actually financed in the first place.
Right, because you don't just magically manifest a modern service and industrial economy out of thin air.
Yeah?
You need capital.
Massive amounts of it.
And the data here points to a massive influx of foreign direct investment, or FDI. After 2010, Foreign capital just flooded into Myanmar.
It was a tidal wave.
At one point, it was exceeding 11% of the total GDP. It looks like a complete financial sugar rush.
The psychology behind that surge is absolutely fascinating. When a previously isolated or heavily restricted frontier market begins to signal an opening to the world, global capital doesn't just trickle in, it stampedes.
Everyone wants a piece of the pie.
Exactly. Investors are hunting for what we call early mover advantages.
Right, they want to be the one who owns the very first cell tower.
Exactly. They want to be the first to build the modern banking infrastructure, the first to introduce consumer packaged goods to an untapped market of over 54 million people.
But we have to look at the nature of that capital, don't we?
We do.
It's not patient capital, is it? I imagine these investors aren't buying 30-year government bonds and waiting for slow, steady returns.
Far from it. Much of this influx behaves remarkably like venture capital.
High risk, high reward.
Exactly. The investors are well aware that they are operating in an environment with historical instability and weak institutional frameworks. Therefore, they demand a massive risk premium.
So they want their money back fast.
They are looking for massive, rapid returns to justify the gamble.
And the defining characteristic of venture capital is that it is notoriously fickle.
Oh, absolutely.
The moment the math changes, the moment the political landscape shifts, and that risk profile upgrades from like exciting high-growth frontier to unpredictable high-risk hazard zone, that capital doesn't stick around to help rebuild.
No, it flees. It evaporates entirely.
And the data shows a sharp retreat in FDI in recent years, which pulls the rug out from under the very industries that capital helped establish.
It's a brutal cycle. When foreign direct investment dries up, currency values often plummet, making imports like fuel and medicine exponentially more expensive.
Which just further accelerates the economic contraction.
Right.
So the sugar rush wears off,
Yeah.
and the withdrawal symptoms are brutal. But there's another financial dynamic here that completely blew my mind.
The debt dynamics.
Yeah, we have to talk about the historical debt pressure versus modern state capacity. Let's wind the clock back to the 1990s for a second.
Okay.
The external debt repayment levels were terrifying. The data indicates that debt service swallowed over 70% of export revenues.
To contextualize that for a moment, just imagine your entire national budget. You export timber, agricultural products, whatever you can sell to the global market.
Okay, Jack.
For every $100 you bring into the country, $70 immediately leaves the country just to pay the interest and principal on external debt.
That is insane.
Yeah.
If I apply that to a personal budget, it's like taking home a paycheck, and 70% of it goes straight to the credit card company before you've bought groceries, paid rent, or even turned the lights on.
Exactly. It leaves the government with virtually zero fiscal space. You can't build hospitals, you can't pave roads.
You can't invest in education.
No, because every single spare dollar is servicing old debt.
It is financially suffocating, and it clearly traps developing nations in a cycle of poverty. Now, over the subsequent decades, through various international mechanisms, debt relief programs, and the GDP growth we discussed, that specific external debt pressure was significantly reduced.
Down to single digits, in fact.
Right. However, the data reveals that it has been replaced by a chronic, equally paralyzing modern problem: an incredibly low tax revenue to GDP ratio.
This is a huge issue.
And this is where the math of running a country completely breaks down for me. If a government's tax revenue is a tiny fractional percentage of its overall economic output, how does it actually function?
It barely does.
Going back to the business analogy, it's like a startup burning through venture capital, that FDI we talked about, but never actually figuring out how to charge its customers. You can't sustain a government without revenue.
You cannot. And this gets to the very heart of what economists term state capacity.
State capacity. Break that down for us.
State capacity is the actual mechanical ability of a government to implement its policies, enforce its laws, and fundamentally collect the revenue required to operate.
So just doing the basic jobs of a state.
Right. When you see a chronically low tax to GDP ratio, it is a glaring diagnostic indicator of a massive informal economy.
So we're talking about people operating entirely outside the system, cash transactions, unregistered businesses.
Precisely. If a citizen runs a shop entirely in cash, if their property rights aren't formally registered with a central authority, or if they are paid under the table, the state has absolutely no mechanism to tax that economic activity.
They can't tax what they can't see.
Exactly. And this creates a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Because the state cannot collect taxes, it cannot fund the public goods that citizens desperately need.
Like reliable electricity grids, paved infrastructure, or robust legal courts.
Right.
And because the state isn't providing those basic services, the citizens have absolutely no incentive to opt into the formal tax system. I mean, why would you pay taxes to a government that isn't providing the infrastructure your business needs to survive?
You wouldn't.
You'd rather keep the cash and buy your own diesel generator.
That is the exact institutional friction that stalls development. The social contract is fundamentally broken.
Wow.
And this macroeconomic friction, this sheer inability to collect revenue and provide services, brings us directly to the human toll. How do these sweeping, abstract numbers actually impact the 54 million people living through this?
Right. Let's
Yeah.
transition to the social dimension. Demographics, poverty, and the reality of inequality.
The population growth alone is remarkable.
The sheer population growth is a story in itself. We went from roughly 21 million people in 1960 to 54 million in 2023. But it's the shape of that population that dictates the economic reality, right?
The structure is everything. The data reveals a massive shift in dependency ratios.
Okay, explain dependency ratios.
So the child dependency ratio, which is the number of children aged 0 to 14 compared to the working age population, plummeted. It went from over 70% in the 1960s to about 44% today.
That's a huge drop.
It is. Simultaneously, the old age dependency ratio is only slowly creeping up, currently moving from around 6.1% to 10.6%.
Let me make sure I'm translating this correctly for the listener. A falling child dependency ratio means that for every adult in the workforce, there are far fewer children they need to feed, clothe, and educate.
Correct.
And because the old age dependency is still relatively low, they also aren't burdened with supporting a massive elderly population that requires pensions and intense medical care.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head. This specific demographic alignment creates a phenomenon known as the demographic dividend.
The demographic dividend.
Yes. It is a rare golden window in a nation's history. You have an absolute maximum number of productive, energetic workers relative to a minimum number of dependents.
So everybody is working and nobody is draining the resources.
If, and this is a massive if, a country can provide productive employment for this bulging working age population, it acts like a rocket booster for economic growth.
Right.
This demographic engine is precisely what powered the rapid rise of the East Asian tiger economies in the late 20th century. They harnessed that massive labor force to completely dominate global manufacturing.
But the data suggests Myanmar's dividend might be trapped, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, yes.
We see all this GDP growth on paper, but when we look at the inequality metrics, the wealth isn't cascading down. The Gini coefficient, which measures economic inequality, remains incredibly sticky.
It's hovering right around 30%.
Now, a Gini of 30 isn't the worst in the world. I mean, it's roughly comparable to some developed nations.
Sure.
But in a developing context with high vulnerability, it tells a very specific story about who is capturing the new wealth.
And the specific wealth distribution data points are stark. The bottom 20% of the population holds only about 9% of the national income.
Wow.
More concerning is that the bottom 50% of the country remains highly vulnerable to slipping back into extreme poverty the moment a macroeconomic shock hits.
It makes me think about that demographic dividend, not as a rising tide that lifts all boats, but as a massive, powerful wave.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Right. Like if you have the capital, the education, and a job in that new 41% service sector, you have a surfboard. You can ride that wave to incredible new heights.
You're perfectly positioned.
But if you are in that bottom 50% working in the shrinking agricultural sector or grinding in the informal cash economy with zero safety net, you don't have a surfboard.
No, you don't.
You are just getting pulled under by the current of inflation and volatility.
That captures the vulnerability perfectly. When we discussed that negative 12 to 18% GDP crash in 2021, we have to view it through this lens of inequality.
It hits different people very differently.
Exactly. For the top 10%, a macroeconomic shock might mean a loss of investment portfolio value or, delayed business expansion.
A bad year on paper.
Right. But for the bottom 50% living on razor-thin margins, a contraction of that size translates instantly into profound human suffering.
Real survival issues.
It means immediate food insecurity. It means families pulling their children out of school because they can no longer afford the hidden costs or because they need the child's labor to survive. It means skipping necessary medical care.
Which brings us to the most baffling, contradictory part of this entire analysis, the health dimension.
Yes, the health data is, well, it's a paradox.
The data on life expectancy and mortality is genuinely miraculous. I don't use that word lightly. But the mechanics behind how it was achieved make almost no sense when you look at the funding.
Let's establish the public health victories first because they really are historic.
Let's hear them.
The data shows life expectancy rocketing from 43.6 years in 1960 to roughly 67 years by 2022.
Just think about the societal implications of that for a second. If the average life expectancy is 43, you are fundamentally living in a short-term society.
You're rushing through life.
Yeah. You likely won't live to see your grandchildren grow up. You have a very limited window to accumulate wealth, pass down skills, or master a profession. By adding over 2 decades to the average lifespan, you change the entire fabric of family structures, workforce experience, and societal memory.
You completely reshape society. Furthermore, the under 5 child mortality rate, which is universally considered one of the most accurate proxy indicators for overall societal health and development, it crashed.
In a good way.
In an incredible way. It fell from a tragic 234 deaths per 1,000 live births in the 1960s to around 43 today.
That is hundreds of thousands of lives saved.
A massive driver of this survival rate is immunization. The data explicitly highlights measles vaccinations, which jumped from near zero in the early decades to over 90% coverage today.
Wow. Millions of lives saved, children surviving past their 5th birthday, adults living into their late 60s. It is a triumph.
It absolutely is.
But here's the paradox. When we look at the domestic infrastructure supporting this miracle, it's virtually non-existent.
It's shockingly low.
The domestic government health spending is hovering around a minuscule 0.26% of GDP. 0.26.
It's barely a rounding error.
And the medical workforce data is just as grim. The report says there are less than 0.75 doctors per 1,000 people.
Less than 1 doctor for every 1,000 citizens.
That is wild. Imagine a town of 10,000 people, and there are only 7 doctors for the whole town. So how does a country double its life expectancy and eradicate mass childhood mortality with virtually zero domestic government health funding and a severe chronic shortage of doctors?
It defies logic.
You can't run a national healthcare system on 0.25% of GDP.
You are absolutely right. You cannot run a national system on that budget. The resolution to this paradox actually lies outside the borders of the country.
Okay, tell me more.
This public health miracle wasn't driven by a robust domestic hospital network. It was driven by global health initiatives and what the public health sector calls vertical programs.
Vertical programs. Walk me through how a vertical program actually operates on the ground, because it seems to be doing all the heavy lifting here.
So a vertical program is a highly targeted, disease-specific intervention, usually funded and organized by massive international entities.
Like the UN or WHO.
Yeah, think of the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, or Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. These organizations recognize that the domestic state capacity, the ability of the government to tax citizens and build hospitals, is weak or non-existent, so they don't wait for the domestic system to mature.
They just bypass it.
Exactly. They come in vertically, they bring their own massive funding, they establish their own parallel supply chains, they hire their own logistical coordinators.
They essentially parachute the solutions directly to the population.
Exactly. If the goal is to eradicate measles, you don't necessarily need a sprawling, highly funded, multidisciplinary hospital in every district.
Right, you just need the vaccines.
You need a highly efficient cold chain logistical network, a supply of vaccines, and trained local workers who can administer a shot in a village square. International aid can deliver that.
So they just focus on one specific outcome.
Yes. They can distribute millions of anti-malarial bed nets or administer broad-spectrum anti-parasitic drugs without ever relying on that domestic 0.26% health budget.
It's an incredible testament to the power of targeted international aid. They bypass the institutional friction to save the patient. But there has to be a limit to that strategy, right?
There is a very hard limit.
Because you could parachute in a cooler of vaccines, but you can't parachute in an oncology ward.
And that is the terrifying catch. Vertical programs are incredibly effective for communicable diseases, infectious viruses, and acute childhood illnesses.
The things you can fix with a shot or a pill.
Right. but they are wholly inadequate for managing chronic, non-communicable diseases. You cannot treat hypertension, chronic heart disease, kidney failure, or cancer with a one-off international logistics drop.
No, those diseases require decades of consistent management.
Exactly.
They require diagnostic laboratories, specialized surgeons, readily available daily medications, and a high density of trained doctors and nurses. They require the exact, robust, domestically funded horizontal healthcare system that Myanmar currently lacks.
Precisely. And if we connect this back to our demographic discussion, remember that the old age dependency ratio is beginning to creep up.
Oh man, I see where this is going.
The international community gave this population the gift of longevity. They are now living into their 60s and 70s.
Which is great, but
As the population ages, the disease burden naturally shifts away from infectious diseases that kill the young toward complex chronic diseases that slowly degrade the old.
the paradox is becoming a ticking time bomb.
It absolutely is. A society cannot manage an aging population's chronic disease burden on 0.26% of GDP. Eventually, the domestic state capacity has to take over, and currently the infrastructure just isn't there.
That is a staggering realization. The very success of the vertical health programs has created a demographic reality that the domestic government is entirely unequipped to handle.
It's a really complex challenge.
Let's shift gears from the health of the body to the development of human capital. If this economy is going to modernize, it needs an educated workforce.
Absolutely.
And the data on education and the gender divide presents another one of these massive structural bottlenecks.
The foundational educational successes are highly visible, though, and they shouldn't be discounted.
Okay, let's start with the good news.
Adult literacy is nearing 90%. For a geographically diverse, historically agrarian nation with severe infrastructure deficits, teaching 9 out of 10 adults to read is a monumental logistical and social achievement.
It really is.
Furthermore, primary school enrollment sits at over 90%. And crucially, at the primary level, there is virtually perfect gender parity. Boys and girls are entering the classroom at equal rates.
That's fantastic. But the pipeline is incredibly leaky, isn't it?
Very leak.
The data shows that when you look at higher education, the enrollment rate plummets to only about 20%.
It's a severe bottleneck.
Yeah.
You have this massive funnel of children gaining basic literacy and numeracy, but only a tiny fraction are making it to the university level to gain the advanced technical, digital, and professional skills that a modern 41% service sector economy desperately demands.
And within that 20% who actually do make it through the bottleneck and get into higher education, we see a fascinating demographic flip.
Yes, the gender flip.
The data explicitly notes that women actually out-enroll men in higher education.
They do.
So you have a highly educated cohort of young women gaining advanced degrees, poised to enter the professional class. But then I looked at the labor force participation numbers, and it genuinely felt like a typo.
It is one of the most glaring inefficiencies in the entire data set.
Let me get this straight. Even though women are securing more of the scarce higher education slots, the female labor force participation rate, meaning women over 15 who are either working or actively looking for work, is only 39%.
Just 39%.
Compare that to the male participation rate, which sits at roughly 76%.
It's a huge disparity.
And to compound the issue, the data shows female representation in parliamentary and political decision-making seats is extremely low. This is a massive systemic leak of human capital.
It's a huge economic loss.
Women are fighting through the educational bottleneck, securing the rare university degrees. But then they are vanishing from the formal workforce and the halls of governance. What is driving that disconnect?
It highlights the intense friction between modernizing educational hardware and sticky traditional cultural software.
Cultural expectations.
Exactly. You can build universities, you can legally mandate equal access to primary education. But if the underlying societal norms dictate that a woman's primary role is domestic, or if cultural expectations heavily pressure women to permanently exit the formal workforce upon marriage or childbirth, those degrees never translate into economic or political power.
It's also an institutional failure, isn't it? If the formal economy doesn't offer childcare infrastructure, or if corporate environments are hostile to female advancement, it becomes economically irrational or practically impossible for a highly educated woman to maintain a career.
Exactly. And from a purely macroeconomic perspective, leaving half of your most educated talent pool on the sidelines is a devastating miscalculation.
Just leaving money on the table.
A country trying to capitalize on its demographic dividend and build a modern service economy simply cannot afford to marginalize its female workforce. The return on investment for all that higher education is being entirely lost to cultural and institutional barriers.
Speaking of rapid modernization crashing into a severe lack of infrastructure, we have to talk about the most aggressive technological shift in this entire report. Let's look at the digital leapfrog.
Ah, yes. The telecommunications boom.
If you look at the data from 2010, the internet penetration rate in Myanmar was essentially 0%.
It was a digitally dark country. Less than 1% of the population had any meaningful access to the global internet.
But by 2022, just over a decade later, that number exploded to nearly 60%. Mobile cellular subscriptions went from virtually non-existent to tens of millions.
It's incredible.
It is incredibly hard to conceptualize the cultural and economic shock of a transition that fast. If you grew up in the West, you experienced the internet incrementally.
Right. It was a slow burn.
You had dial-up modems that tied up the phone line. You had bulky desktop computers. You transitioned to broadband, that eventually to basic cell phones, and finally to smartphones. Society had decades to adapt to the concept of being constantly connected.
The incremental adaptation allowed legal frameworks, societal norms, and security infrastructure to co-evolve with the technology, albeit slowly.
But Myanmar skipped the dial-up era entirely.
They bypassed the desktop computer phase.
They went to sleep in an analog, physically isolated world and woke up directly holding affordable smartphones connected to 4G networks.
It's a literal leapfrog. They instantly had access to global social media algorithms, mobile digital banking, and instant messaging.
The positive socioeconomic impacts of that leapfrog are undeniable. I mean, it democratizes information.
Oh, absolutely.
A rural farmer who used to rely on a middleman can suddenly check real-time commodity prices in the capital city before selling their crop. Unbanked citizens can instantly transfer money across the country using mobile ledgers.
It is the exact digital infrastructure that enabled that rapid pivot to a service economy we discussed earlier.
But the data reveals a terrifying structural flaw beneath this digital boom, doesn't it?
It does. While basic mobile internet penetration skyrocketed, the metric measuring secure internet servers per capita remains incredibly low.
Explain what that implies, because to a layman, a server is just a box in a data center. Why does the lack of secure servers matter if everyone already has a smartphone?
Think of it like building a modern, towering skyscraper on a foundation of loose sand.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
The smartphones are the state-of-the-art electrical wiring and lighting on the top floor, highly visible and functional. But the secure servers, the encryption protocols, the domestic data privacy laws, and the cybersecurity frameworks, that is the concrete foundation.
And they don't have the foundation.
Myanmar imported the consumer technology instantly, but they did not and could not instantly import the decades of cybersecurity maturity required to protect it.
So you have a highly connected populace, nearly 60% of 54 million people running their social lives, their political discourse, and their business transactions on an incredibly fragile, undersecured digital infrastructure.
Precisely. And when a population leapfrogs into digital connectivity without foundational digital literacy or secure infrastructure, they become massively vulnerable.
Vulnerable to what, exactly?
They are vulnerable to state surveillance, to rampant cybercrime, to massive data breaches, and to devastating misinformation campaigns that can spread with algorithmic speed.
Because there's no filter.
Exactly. If your entire new service economy relies on this digital network, and that network lacks basic security architecture, a single coordinated cyber event or physical infrastructure failure can paralyze the nation's ability to function.
It's the ultimate double-edged sword of the leapfrog. You get the benefits of the future, but you inherit all the vulnerabilities of a system that was never properly built from the ground up.
It's a huge risk.
And this fragility brings us to the final and most crucial dimension of our deep dive: the root constraints.
The underlying foundation.
The foundation that dictates whether a nation can secure its internet, collect its taxes, build its hospitals, or protect its vulnerable populations. We have to look at governance and the environment.
And here, we must rely on the cold, objective, institutional data. Pulling from the World Governance Indicators, or the WGI, the data paints a picture of a severe, almost impenetrable governance ceiling.
For those unfamiliar, the World Governance Indicators are a massive research dataset produced by the World Bank. They aggregate views on the quality of governance from thousands of enterprise, citizen, and expert survey respondents worldwide.
It measures things like rule of law, regulatory quality, and control of corruption.
And the numbers for Myanmar are deeply concerning. In the 2010s, their metric for control of corruption was sitting in the bottom 1 percentile globally.
Let that sink in.
That means over 98% of the world's nations ranked better in controlling the abuse of public power for private gain. Furthermore, the metrics for political stability and the absence of violence consistently registered deep in the negative zone across the entire timeline of the report.
The numbers are very clear.
Now, to be absolutely clear, our goal here isn't to take political sides or analyze the specific ideological factions vying for power. We are looking at this purely through the lens of developmental mechanics.
Right, from a structural standpoint.
How does a bottom percentile corruption score and chronic political instability mechanically prevent a country from developing?
It acts as an absolute ceiling on long-term macroeconomic growth. Let's connect this back to everything we've discussed. Remember the FDI sugar rush?
The venture capital rush, yeah.
High-quality foreign investment, the kind that builds advanced manufacturing plants, transfers technical knowledge to the local workforce, and creates sustainable multi-decade employment, requires a predictable legal environment.
Predictability is key.
A multinational corporation will not invest hundreds of millions of dollars if they cannot trust that contracts will be enforced in a fair court of law, or if they fear their assets might be arbitrarily seized.
So when governance metrics are this core, the high-quality capital stays away, and you are left only with the high-risk venture capital that flees at the first sign of trouble.
Exactly. Furthermore, weak governance stalls poverty reduction because of structural leakage.
Structural leakage, what does that mean in practice?
Even if the state manages to collect some tax revenue, if corruption is rampant, those public funds leak out of the system into private hands instead of being deployed to build that robust domestic healthcare system or train those university students.
It just drains the resources. And this institutional fragility has another deeply silent victim: the physical environment itself.
The ecological data is heartbreaking.
The ecological degradation numbers in this report are staggering. The data shows forest cover shrinking from roughly 392,000 square kilometers in 1990 down to just 279,000 square kilometers in 2021.
That's a massive loss of forest.
And agriculture, despite shrinking as a percentage of GDP, remains the primary driver of massive methane and nitrous oxide greenhouse gas emissions.
The environmental destruction is a direct mechanical symptom of the weak governance we just discussed.
How so?
Environmental protection is inherently a long-term project. Conserving a forest or transitioning to sustainable, low-emission agricultural practices requires the strict enforcement of property rights.
Right.
It requires the well-funded policing of protected ecological areas and the consistent regulation of extractive industries over decades.
But if the institutions are unstable and political power is constantly shifting, no one is looking 30 years into the future.
Precisely. When governance is weak, the time horizons of every actor within the country drastically shrink. People, corporations, and even local authorities look to liquidate natural resources as rapidly as possible for short-term capital.
Because they don't know what tomorrow brings.
They don't trust that the system will protect their investments or their land rights long-term.
It's the ultimate tragedy of the commons, played out on a national scale. You chop down the ancient teak forest today and sell the timber, because if you leave the trees standing, you have no guarantee that someone else won't just come and chop them down tomorrow.
Exactly. There's no regulatory framework strong enough to enforce sustainable horizons.
And the brutal irony is that this rapid ecological liquidation eventually loops right back around to suffocate the economy.
It's a closed loop. Deforestation destroys the watersheds necessary for the agricultural base. It increases the severity of floods and droughts, making the poorest 50%, those without the surfboards, even more vulnerable to climate shocks.
Which in turn drives more instability. It is a closed, devastating loop. It all connects.
The entire system is intertwined.
The GDP volatility, the informal tax economy, the missing domestic health care, the vulnerable digital leapfrog, and the shrinking forests. Every broken system is compounding the stress on every other system.
It's a complex web of challenges.
Which brings us to the synthesis of this massive data assessment. How do you even begin to untangle a diagnostic not this complex? The report lays out 4 core recommendations.
Yes. The data points toward 4 necessary simultaneous pillars of action.
Walk us through them.
First, stabilize the macroeconomy to halt the wild volatility. You must create a predictable environment to attract high-quality, long-term foreign direct investment rather than fleeting venture capital.
Okay, that makes sense. Get the stable money in.
Second, drastically and urgently increase domestic government health spending. The international vertical programs bought the country time and longevity, but the domestic system must build the horizontal hospital infrastructure necessary to manage the chronic diseases of an aging population.
Third, they have to leverage that massive overnight digital boom. They have the connectivity. Now they need to push technical and digital higher education, specifically focusing on closing the gender gap in the workforce to provide the human capital that the service sector demands.
Spot on. And finally, enforce ecological restoration. They must implement sustainable agricultural practices and halt the rapid liquidation of forest assets to protect the physical foundation of the country from cascading climate shocks.
And this is exactly why dissecting a case study like Myanmar is so profoundly important for anyone listening right now who's interested in global development, economics, or even business.
It's a masterclass in complexity.
It shatters the illusion that progress is a guaranteed straight-line march up a neat, linear chart. It proves that modernization is messy. It is inherently nonlinear.
You can have a smartphone in your pocket and a life expectancy of 67, while simultaneously living in an economy that can shrink by 18% in a single year due to institutional collapse.
If you only look at the peaks of the GDP chart or the speed of the digital adoption, you think you are witnessing an economic miracle.
But when you look at the foundational data, the tax collection, the secure servers, the governance metrics, you see the profound fragility of building a modern society without the institutional concrete to support it.
It requires looking at the entirety of the interconnected system. And building on that idea of the leapfrog, I want to leave you with a final provocative concept to mull over.
Oh, this is a great thought experiment.
We saw how Myanmar completely leapfrogged a century of physical telecommunications infrastructure. They skipped the costly, slow process of laying millions of miles of copper landlines and jumped straight into the decentralized mobile internet era.
Right, they just skipped right over it.
It begs a profound question for the future of all developing nations. Can a country eventually use next-generation decentralized technologies to leapfrog traditional bureaucratic governance in the exact same way?
That is the million-dollar question. If the state capacity is broken, if the institutions are too corrupt or slow to register land rights or distribute welfare, could a developing nation utilize blockchain technology to create an immutable, transparent registry of property rights that bypasses local corruption entirely?
Could they use AI-driven civic platforms to deliver localized, hyper-efficient government services, entirely skipping the need to build a massive 20th century-style administrative bureaucracy?
Or, unlike copper telephone wires, is human political evolution stubbornly tethered to a slow, linear, messy path? Can you download state capacity from the cloud, or does trust and governance have to be built brick by brick, decade by decade?
If you can skip the dial-up modem, can you skip the corrupt bureaucracy? I absolutely love that framing. We started this deep dive talking about how development isn't clean engineering, it is muddy waters.
Very muddy.
But by rigorously breaking down the mechanisms behind the numbers, from the cascading effects of a GDP crash to the paradox of parachute medicine, from the missing women in the formal workforce to the tragedy of the shrinking forests, we can start to actually understand the narrative hidden inside the data.
It's been a fascinating journey through the numbers.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive and for letting us be your guides. Keep questioning the charts, keep looking for the hidden mechanics behind the paradoxes, and we'll catch you on the next one.